Afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Way, Director of Client Relationships at LexisNexis Canada. Thank you and welcome to the second panel discussion in our series, Technology and Litigation, Shifting Paradigms. Today, we will look at how technology and the discipline of legal operations has transformed the work of in-house legal departments in Canada, and accordingly transformed the relationship between those departments and their external counsel. The early days of legal technology and innovation were largely focused on lawyers in private practice and law firms, automating and digitizing many of the traditional tasks of those private practice lawyers. However, over the past 2 decades, as the legal technology has matured, we have seen a simultaneous revolution in internal legal departments, as in-house lawyers have grown in numbers, in stature, in power, and in influence. The discipline of legal operations is one area where the evolution of legal technology and in-house counsel have come together. And I'm looking forward to hearing from our expert panelists today, each of whom brings unique experience and perspective to the conversation. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. We have received a tremendous response to this session with over 1,000 registrations. So we are hosting a very large audience today. And as I am doing introductions to the panel, we will put up a quick audience poll to get things started. Please let us know which of the following statements applies to your organization. Has your organization formally adopted legal operations? Has your organization adopted some technical and business processes on a more informal basis? Or are you wondering what is legal operations? So as you're answering that, let's meet our panelists for today. First, Robert Ambrogi. Bob Ambrogi has made his career at the intersection of law, media, and technology. A Massachusetts lawyer, journalist, media consultant, and blogger, Bob has been covering legal technology for more than 20 years. He writes the award-winning blog Law Sites, is a columnist for Above the Law and the ABA Journal, and hosts the podcast Law Next about innovation in law. He also works with the legal publishing and software company LexBlog as publisher and editor-in-chief. Bob is a fellow of the College of Law Practice Management and an inaugural Fast Case 50 honoree, which recognizes the law's smartest, most courageous innovators, techies, visionaries, and leaders. Thank you, Bob, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Melissa LaFlair. Melissa is Director, Legal Operations at Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, the Workplace Compensation Board for Ontario. Melissa joined the WSIB in late January 2019 as their first Director, Legal Operations. In this role, she draws on over 20 years of experience as a lawyer, a client, executive consultant, and certified project management professional. Her approach to legal operations is pragmatic, incorporating resource allocation, risk, data, operational strategy, user experience, expectation setting, and habit-based change considerations. She is also passionate about fostering the lawyer-client relationship. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Shaya Silber is with us today. Shaya is pricing counsel at Blake, Castles & Graydon, one of Canada's top business law firms. A former practicing lawyer, Shaya now focuses on developing fee arrangements that align with their clients' evolving priorities. Shaya counsels the firm's partners on scoping, pricing, and negotiating the delivery of legal services and optimizing the value delivered to clients. He also works across the firm to track and measure alternative fee arrangement performance and continuously improve Blake's service delivery. Thank you, Shai, for joining us. And last but not least, Dana Zuech. Dana is AVP Legal Operations at Sun Life. In this role, she is responsible for leading the management of the legal operations function and related initiatives at Sun Life. This includes defining and executing the legal team's strategic plan, technology systems, and process optimization, outside counsel and vendor management, budget and financial management, as well as using data effectively. Prior to her current role, Dana managed a busy litigation portfolio for 10 years before moving into several leadership positions in both legal and claims teams with large property and casualty insurers in Toronto. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you, Eric. Happy to be here.
Got a great mix of expertise on our panel. Before we kick things off, let's take a look at where you, the audience, told us you're at with the poll. And I think I'd like to get a few reactions from the panel, but for those of you who can't see it, the winner by a landslide is what is legal operations? 73% of the audience. Next is my organization has adopted some of the aspects of legal operations, 19%, and only 8% of the audience has formally adopted legal operations as a business model. So let's kick things off there. Dana, I'm going to start with you. Our first topic was really what is legal operations? How has it changed legal departments? It looks like the poll's telling us that there's a real demand for some that basic information.
Yeah,
So
right.
why don't I leave with you? What is legal operations and what's your reaction to what the poll is telling us?
But not surprised, because I think that legal operations as a function of a corporate legal team is certainly something that's been evolving, mostly over the last 5 to 10 years. So still relatively new in the space. But when we're talking about what legal operations is, we're talking about a focus on the business activities of the team, not the substantive work that your various practice areas are involved in, but rather what are their activities. And the scope of that can vary across corporate teams depending on their team structure, their roles and accountabilities, and the resources that are available. Functions can include things like strategic planning, outside counsel and vendor management, insights, analytics and reporting, process improvement and technology. And with that, you're expanding who you're working with across your organization. You're working with finance teams, you're working with your procurement, you're working with your risk management, more specifically information security and records retention, privacy and compliance. And layer on top of that an additional set of skills that we weren't taught in law school. Data mapping, process optimization, data analysis and visualization, project management. So these sort of additional skill sets that have led to creations of new roles within a corporate legal department that didn't exist years ago. Things such as, legal spend specialists and system analysts who are focused really on how the legal technology functions and the information that you can derive out of that to support your team.
I feel like picking up from the poll that only 8% in our audience have adopted it formally. As someone who is part of an organization that has formal legal ops, do you feel like very much that you're in the minority still, meaning that you have to answer this question quite a bit when you talk to people about what is it that you do and what's your function?
It is, because there's, when people think corporate legal departments, obviously they're thinking of the different practice areas. So getting that sort of mind shift towards, no, I'm not handling files, I'm not handling matters, but I'm involved in the elements that are around it. That's certainly something that always creates a lot of questions about what that looks like and frankly, how did you get there? The path to legal operations wasn't something that, resonated with me when I was coming up through law school, nor in the early days of my practice.
Well, Melissa, let me bring you in here to sort of answer that. Well, first of all, if you could build on what Dana is saying, if there's another aspect there, but also where did legal operations kind of come from? What were some of the industries or communities, or what are some of the underlying factors that are driving the development of this practice?
Yeah, I think in response to both of your questions. I like taking a bit of a step back and looking at, why do we need legal operations? And a big driver is that legal answers are very expensive. And the more expensive it gets, the more you need to understand why the services are being provided. So to me, I look at legal operations and I really condense all of the various elements that Dana has reviewed into three buckets. And the first is being able to articulate and understand why the services are being provided. What is it that you're trying to help the client achieve? What are the organizational objectives? What role does that legal answer play in helping drive the client's success? So that's the sort of the fundamental bucket. Then the two other buckets that I sort of put various legal operations efforts under would be the what services should be delivered. In law school, lawyers are trained to come up with the perfect answer. And the reality in the business world is that perfect is usually too expensive and not practical. And so it's understanding what should be delivered. And that's where you're looking at sort of the data and the cost benefit analysis, the financial aspects, and figuring out what's good enough to get the client where they need to be within their risk tolerance. And then that sort of ties to the third bucket, which is how should services be delivered to most effectively and efficiently address the why. Every single question doesn't need a Cadillac response. And so how do you adjust and size your effort to meet the needs of the client who's ultimately paying the bill? So that to me is sort of legal operations in a nutshell, and there are lots of different permutations and combinations that go into it, and of the many things that Dana was talking about that are all relevant to answering these why, what, and how questions, and how people have come up with it. We've been borrowing, begging, stealing from all kinds of other industries. You look at whether it's construction industry for, processes, IT industry, process mapping, and data and probabilities from risk. And, we're culling together disciplines from all over the business world and applying them in a legal context.
Going back to what you said at the beginning, though, when you said legal services are expensive as one of the fundamental reasons for this, is it fair to say that the discipline had its initial roots in a cost-driven analysis trying to reduce and manage that spend? Is that the genesis of legal operations?
And that's where legal operations gets a bad rap, because everyone thinks it's all about cost. And so it's, to me, it's so much more than that. It's about making a cost benefit, accountability, and value-based decision. Like, you want those three elements to align. So do you have alignment between the cost, the benefit that's being created? Is there accountability, and is what's delivered helping make the problem go away? And that's where you drive value. So to me, it really is a value thing. It's being able to articulate the value of the work.
Bob, can I turn it to you for a sec? Talking about legal operations, what is it? Where is it coming from? Can you give us a bit of a broader perspective? Well, I guess I got two questions for you. What do you make of the poll? Is that typical in an international perspective, those results? And then maybe you could take us back a little bit. My understanding is legal operations did not originate in Canada. It originated, I believe, in the United States. And maybe tell us a little bit about that. How do we get from there to here?
Well, yeah, I was actually a little bit surprised by the poll. I mean, not enormously surprised, but I think the good news is all of those people who don't know much about legal operations have come to the right place, and hopefully they will learn more today. I kind of trace this back to, well, let me say two things. One is I draw an analogy to law firms, and to something, a truism about law firms is that lawyers never learn anything in law school about running a business. And that was a problem for many years for law firms, in that law firms were not run efficiently as businesses. And that's still a problem for a lot of law firms. And I think the same was true for corporate legal departments. Legal departments often operated as almost like, little mini law firms within a corporation, without being attuned to the business operations necessarily of the business for which they worked, or even of their own operation as a business unit. I think what really started to drive the change there was the Great Recession of 2008, when pressure came from within, I think, on legal departments to take more responsibility for their budgets and their spending, to push to develop more efficiencies internally and to push for more efficiencies from their outside counsel. And I think that really is what was the genesis of the legal ops role. I remember talking to a legal ops person a few years ago, somebody who had been a pioneer in it, who said, defined his role as chief operating officer, chief technology officer, chief knowledge officer, sort of taking all those C-suite roles in a traditional business and putting those within the legal ops, within a legal department in a business. But it's a role, and Dana and Melissa can talk much more to this than I can, but it's a role that I think has been taking shape gradually over the last decade, and has different definitions perhaps in different enterprises. I know earlier, a month or two ago, I interviewed Mary Shen O'Carroll, who had started the legal ops function at Google. She was the first head of legal operations at Google. And one of the funny things that she said to me is that when she took on that role, she wasn't really sure what legal ops was, and she didn't think the people who hired her was really sure what legal ops was, but they knew they needed it. And I think that it really kind of characterizes how this has evolved, but it's certainly become much more sophisticated. There is the, in the United, I guess CLOC is an international organization, the Corporate Legal Operations Consortium, which is basically a professional organization devoted to this field, and that's kind of developed some standards and guidelines around the field. So, its roots go back to 2008, but it's evolved significantly since then.
Bob, can you give us a snapshot of how big is the footprint in the US, whether it's sort of by, I don't know how for you to express that, like across the Fortune 500 or across certain industries? Is it now sort of firmly entrenched, and is it widespread? Would it be fair to say that legal ops has really found its place?
I think certainly among the larger corporate sector in the United States, legal ops is pretty much entrenched. To various degrees. I mean, there may be a legal ops person, or there may be a legal ops group within a legal department. So I think it's pretty entrenched. The mid-market and smaller businesses, I think there's still a lot of people who would be like the poll we did at the opening here, kind of wondering exactly what it is and whether they need it and why they might need it. But certainly my sense is, and I don't have any hard and fast numbers, but the sense is that among the larger corporations, it's there.
So Shaya, let me turn to you to get the external law firm's perspective on legal ops. Obviously, this is a real change in that relationship. What are you seeing? I guess, first of all, are you seeing this across your clients, and how has the firm responded to this change?
Yeah, I'm speaking from my experience. When I started in my pricing LPM role about 6 years ago at my previous firm, it was a relatively new field in Canada. And it's been around a bit longer in the US and the UK. And at first, part of the role was going around and educating our internal market around AFAs and pricing and LPM and all those sorts of things. But now I think there's a general understanding about what we can offer. And for a lot of the partners, when they receive a request for an AFA or even just a budget, their first stop is usually our team, which is great. And I think one of the main reasons for that is the growth legal ops with many of our clients, and just our clients becoming more sophisticated around procurement of legal services. And we're seeing it, I would say, through the full relationship lifecycle, everything from the procurement of external counsel. We're seeing, new processes around the procurement of legal services, and I think it flows through to tracking and reporting. So, we've established processes to make sure that we're tracking matters that we're able to report back to our clients, so that they have visibility into the financial health of their matter, and it goes through all the way through billing, post-matter debriefing. And we're seeing a lot of legal ops folks really driving the conversation around value, which is great because those conversations can really align both parties and strengthen the relationship in a meaningful way.
Is it fair to say that some of the functions at the firms like yours have evolved either in direct response to the legal ops revolution, or at least at the same time as the client's expectations changing?
Certainly, yeah. Like I said, when I started, we had to go around and educate our market about what we do and how we can help our partners. But I think there is a good understanding now across the firm around what we can do and how we can help. And I think the main driver for that is, the external, demand for that sort of service and that sort of, planning and visibility.
Let's move to our second section, which is, let's talk about some of the specific technology and process improvements and how they can increase the effectiveness of in-house lawyers. Melissa, I want to bring you in here and ask you, can you give us some specific examples of some of the business functions and process improvements that you've brought in under legal ops? I know there's a lot of talk about technology. I think we'll get to that as well. But let's start with something maybe that's not pure technology, but a business process or an improvement that you can use as a concrete example of legal ops in action.
Yeah, and it sounds really basic and really silly, but I think it's really fundamental, which is helping teams understand what is it that they do that's routine, what is it that they do that's repetitive, and what is it that they do that's unique, and how they go about their day-to-day. Because all legal work falls under one of those three buckets, and which bucket it falls under is going to be determined by your context and by your area of expertise. The routine stuff is the stuff that's pretty much the same thing you do day in and day out. The repetitive is, something that's similar. You've done something like it before, but it's not exactly the same. And unique is it's unusual, but it's never been done before. And this decoupling of work and not looking at every single thing you do as a special little snowflake is a massive mindset change for the legal profession, because they look at every problem as unique. And while every answer might be unique based on the circumstances, the process of how you get there and how you approach it is not. Just by the nature of the name routine, if it's routine, it's pretty much the same. And you could take, for example, if you were the transit authority in Toronto, the public transit, issuing metro passes, which are technically contracts, are very routine. That is a transaction. So someone put thought into how you set that up, but once it's up, it just it runs. Repetitive is probably slip and falls, and I'm sure they regularly deal with slip and falls. And something unique would be buying a new set of subway trains or a new set of streetcars. And so their environment is going to determine what is routine, repetitive, and unique for them. And what I find fascinating, when I was in my consulting life, I was dealing with a firm. There was a new GC that wanted to understand, have me do a survey and work with the team to understand what they were doing. And when I explained routine, repetitive, unique to them and asked them to think about their work and how they would divide it up, the lowest percentage, so the least amount of unique work that they reported they did, was 96%. So you've got a whole department of people trying to tell me that when they come in every day, they're not exactly sure how to do what's facing them because it's never been done before, 96% of the time. There's no way. So it sounds really silly, but something that fundamental of understanding and changing the mindset is a huge non-technical change that has to happen within the legal profession to really get the value and the benefit of legal operations.
Did you say that that kind of mindset change is one of the first things you need to do if you're hired as the first VP
Well,
of legal operations? Is that job one?
Well, no, so job one, there's so many different elements. It's sort of getting a lay of the land and taking your inventory of what's going on, because there's a mindset element, there's a change management element. You can't really, it's a huge element of it. You can't go and have people's mindset change. You have to show them benefits, show them things. So, I'll bring in retainer templates. You look at processes that they do that are a pain for them and address, and it's something they don't like doing. It tends to be routine work. How can you bring in templates? How can you bring in processes? How can you bring in guidelines and frameworks to help make that less painful? And then, they're sort of realizing, oh, maybe legal operations isn't so bad, and maybe it's not something I need to fight and avoid. So there are different approaches and techniques. And I think looking at the main pain points and understanding that there is a mindset shift that happens as part of addressing the pain points, those two sort of work hand in hand.
Say there is some resistance though. I mean, just you get a result that they think I'm understating it probably.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. What's either an anecdote that encapsulates that, or?
I think the resistance is based on a few things. One is the legal profession is designed based on precedents and looking backwards. And legal operations is about looking forwards and forecasting and figuring out how are we going to deal with what's coming, instead of being firefighting, looking back mode. So part of it's just how we're trained. We're also trained as lawyers. I say this as a lawyer, we're trained to look at what's unique, what's different. And now we're asking people to shift their perspective and look at, well, what's the same? I know you're trained to find what's different, but now let's look at what's the same, because the volume is more than we can handle. I have yet to find a department, and that's the third element why there's resistance. Typically, lawyers are so busy, they barely have time to put out the stuff on their desk. And then you're asking them to think and work and do things differently. And they're like, I don't have time for that. I barely have time to do the stuff that I know how to do. And, so if you're asking people, okay, if you spend 1 hour to think about this tricky, difficult thing that you're not sure how to do and what the answer is going to be, or 5 hours doing something you know how to do rolling out of bed, they will pick the 5 hours. They will pick that effort because it's easier and they've got a lot on their plate. So I think it's an environmental thing and a training and a background and a risk aversion. Like a lot of lawyers go into law because they don't have the same risk tolerance as business people. So that you've got a few factors that are making it challenging for lawyers to pivot dramatically and quickly. So it's more of a slow burn and a slow evolution. Because I think just going back to Bob's earlier point of, he thinks this, he sees things starting in 2008, and really elements of legal operations started way back. I'm not sure how many years ago, but when Bob Azis was at TD Bank and brought in e-billing, that's a version of legal operations. It's a version of trying to derive value, and that was way before. That was in the 1990s. At some point. So, it is a slow, it's not a quick change. This is a slow conversion.
I'm trying to think, can we see Dana? I wanted to see Dana's reaction as Melissa's talking about that. Dana, I wanted to ask you, talk about specific technology, but that's too good of a point. Melissa talking about the reception, the resistance, traditional legal departments. What's been your experience in that area?
Yeah, I mean, Melissa sort of really encapsulated what some of the challenges are. Absolutely, there is, that bit of pushback that you get from, your own department because they are busy and you're introducing significant change. So it is a challenge, and you have to figure out how to manage that change, and that's an ongoing, continuous process. That's certainly something that's continuing to evolve. What I have seen, and certainly my experience over the last year and a half, is lawyers are sort of coming around to that shift that, just the sheer fact of COVID and everyone having to work from home has wrought into everyone's daily practice. There was a mentality that assistants could never work anywhere but the office. And yet we know that with the right tools and technology, they've been able to support their teams virtually. You couldn't do an examination for discovery, had to be done in person, and you had to travel hours to, get there sometimes if you're traveling out of town, because you had to see the person face to face. Well, people have had to pivot and do that over Zoom or WebEx or whatever technology they're using. So certainly the change over the last year and a half, I think, has sort of opened the eyes a bit. I think has helped to lessen the resistance, because people have just had to adjust and be more agile to adapt to the changing nature of how we've been working.
Dana, I wanted to ask you about the technology side as well. We heard about mindset and process. Can you give us one or two examples of specific technology changes that you've brought in under legal operations?
Yeah, I mean, one of the absolutely sort of critical pieces is around sort of your matter and document management. These are critical data points that, your legal leadership certainly wants to understand. And get reports and analytics and insights into, how many matters are we handling internally? How many matters are going external? What's the complexity of them? What's the type? What's the jurisdiction? Are we seeing trending? The spend, and Melissa had mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the advent of e-billing. E-billing allows us to visualize data with a speed that, we wouldn't have been able to do previously when we were reviewing paper invoices. It allows you to slice and dice to highlight, e-billing is something that we've just sort of introduced over the last year. And there's a massive amount of data that's contained in that system that gives you that high level view on how much you're spending, but it also gives you granular data that allows you to have discussions with your external counsel. What Shaya had talked about earlier, in terms of, if a lawyer is asked to provide a budget, or there's questions around pricing or alternate fee arrangements. The corporate legal departments are certainly driving some of these discussions because, we're able to sort of understand, through the data analysis that we're getting from our technology, to get more granular into, how is a matter being staffed? Who's doing the work on it? What needs to be done at what level? The comment that Melissa made about risk rating. Everyone wants absolutely to do their best work without question, and we certainly don't want to sacrifice quality of work, but you also want to see application of a risk mindset of, what's this case worth and what are the resources that I need to allocate to it, because there are only so many hours in the day. So the technology, supports those types of discussions. in terms of other types of technology that we've introduced for our litigation team, we brought in, an automated document assembly for that high volume, high frequency documentation, eliminating the cut and paste from years past, having precedents so that, certain things are, somewhat more boilerplate. Again, what Melissa said about evaluating the type of work that you're doing. Is it routine? Is it repetitive? Well, in the litigation space with certain type of litigation, it can be somewhat repetitive when you're looking at pleadings. So how can we save time and effort? And automated document assembly has certainly been a solution for that particular issue. Depending on the scope of what your team does, there are, other types of technology out there. If you have an intellectual property component, there are platforms that will manage your IP. There's e-discovery, of course, which is, a significant technology piece as well. So those are some examples.
From those examples, Shaya, I know that for a long time, the law firms were doing similar process improvements under knowledge management and at least the perception was for many years that private practice was a little bit ahead when we talk about things like e-discovery, document assembly, precedents. What's the connection, if any, between legal ops and what's been happening with the practice innovation with the firms? Have ideas been shared, or are the firms even in the business now of selling the expertise or passing that expertise on to their in-house?
I think in the same way that in-house legal ops folks are thinking about ways of improving departmental efficiency, I think on the law firm side, the innovation teams are very much thinking about the same thing, right? They're trying to answer the question of how can we make our service delivery more efficient. And while the law firm innovation groups and the in-house legal ops folks might not be perfect symmetrical images of each other, I think they're very much rooted in the same philosophy, and I think there's a ton of overlap between the two for sure. I think an example, Melissa and Dana were talking about segmenting files by level of complexity. So we had a client, was a key client. They had the in-house team wanted to outsource a large portfolio of repeat files, right? It was taking up a lot of time. It was a very low complexity, but just chewing up the department's time. And so the client had problems with their current process for getting those files done. And so what we did, we worked with the client and we mapped out their existing process. So we took some time, we sat down with them, we tried to understand their existing process. And then we took that back and we completely redesigned the process with a new clear playbook. We layered in technology. We took a fresh look at staffing. We looked at some alternative staffing that we hadn't previously considered. And then we designed pricing that reflected the client's objectives. So the client had cost certainty. There was a huge cost reduction. And in short, they went from a slow, frustrating, expensive process to a lean and cost-effective one. And I think most importantly, what was most valuable to the client is that, yes, it was, that it saved a lot of time, saved a lot of money, but it also freed up their in-house legal team to focus on high-level strategic business issues and not get bogged down, reviewing hundreds or thousands of these documents every year. So that I think is a good example that speaks to what Melissa and Dana were talking about.
You've heard a bunch of things about stuff on the process side, stuff on the technology side, coming from a bigger market with maybe a little bit more maturity and sophistication in legal ops. Is there any one or two things that we haven't talked about that are top of mind when you think what is legal ops in terms of concrete changes?
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's fair any longer to break the market down by geographic boundaries, because the corporate legal market is really international at this point. And I think one point that's worth talking about, just for those who aren't all that familiar with this market, is 5 years ago you could not get venture finance companies to pay much attention to the legal tech market. And suddenly the amount of venture capital investment in the legal tech market has just been skyrocketing. It's just off the charts in terms of money being put into this market. And where's that money going? Well, a whole lot of it is going into developing technology directed at corporate legal in some way, shape, or form or another. A lot of it has to do with contract lifecycle management software or platforms, which is technology that's sort of directed around this whole idea of enabling an enterprise to manage the life cycle of contracts from the negotiation and pre-signature process, as well as once you've signed these agreements, how do you know what's in all these agreements? I mean, the contracts are the lifeblood of a corporation, and yet corporations traditionally did not have a good way of really understanding what's in all of those contracts that they were a party to. So that's been a huge area. You said it, Eric, I think at the outset of the program, you made a reference to, is this all about spend and managing spend? It's not all about that, but spend technology has also been a huge area right now. And with a focus again on gathering data about how law firms bill for matters and what kinds of insights can be gleaned from that data. Some of those insights relate to just pricing matters. Can we more predictably or accurately price a matter? It used to be, you'd go to your outside counsel and they'd say, you'd say, you've got this litigation matter. What's it going to cost us? And they'd say, well, we don't know. It's an hourly rate and we can't tell you what it's going to cost. Well, now you can predict more closely, and we haven't gotten away from the hourly rate entirely, but we are getting better at budgeting and predicting. Just as an aside, I thought something a really interesting use of billing data that I was just talking to somebody about is to advance diversity in outside counsel. One company in particular, I know Digitory Legal is a US-based company that has pricing, spend management technology, but they've been kind of pushing this issue of legal departments have been looking for greater diversity in their outside law firms. And one way to enforce that is through the outside counsel guidelines that you establish around billing. If you can collect data on how work is being allocated within a law firm, are women and people of color being given the scut work? Who's getting the choice assignments? How are those being assigned? That tells you what the opportunities are for enhancing diversity within a law firm. So that's kind of a very focused, but very interesting, I think, application of how data is just changing the whole relationship between legal departments and outside law firms. So
yeah, let's bring in Shaya here. I know our great segue, Bob. It's almost like we planned it. The next chunk is intended to talk about data. And I think you started that in an interesting place. I know I do want to hear from Melissa and Dana about spend management and all of that. But Shaya, talk about what Bob just mentioned, diversity, inclusion, the staffing data. Are you seeing that from your clients as well? How is the firm responding to that?
Yeah, my focus is on the LPM side. So it's really matter tracking, to gather data around staffing, fees, leverage, at what level are we staffing, what level of seniority. But I think, as more organizations and a lot of our clients are adopting certain, they're adopting goals around diversity data. I think we're seeing that come through in RFP requests. And so, we're getting better at collecting that data and being able to share it so that, we are aligned with our clients' corporate objectives and ensuring that, we're making sure that we're also, we're also, meeting those goals as well.
Now, Dana, let's talk about data. I know touched on different types, whether it's contract analytics, spend data, billing data, diversity. Which of those, are they all important? Is there one that's maybe more interesting and important to you?
No, all important. The data related to your matters and spend is table stakes. I think for any legal operations team. But absolutely, the growing importance of that diversity data. I would add sustainability to that as well, and how you can embed that in your own internal practices, and understanding digital and the technological advancements. So it's not just those quantifiable measurements. It's also that sort of broader ecosystem that the legal operations is interested in. Case in point, for us, we do an annual review with our law firms each year. And in addition to those matter and billing data points, we do want to understand other things that the firms are up to. Certainly around diversity, community involvement, those other value add services around training and seminars that all go into the management of the relationship. It's not just about the billing guidelines. It really truly is a broader relationship.
Alyssa, can I bring you in on that? Talk about how you use the data specifically around the relationship with external counsel.
So how we use it with external counsel is one of the ways that we're using it. That's all tied to our budget and our resourcing. So I've got one bucket that's a combination of internal resources and external resources, and they're going to work together. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. So they're going to work together and how we use them and how we're allocating. Just as Shaya was saying earlier, in some cases it makes sense for us to ship out repetitive work. In other cases, it makes sense for us to keep it. We definitely want to have the maximum amount of higher risk, higher complexity work being done by our in-house team because they know our business. And so for me, it's that relationship. It's the relationship between the internal team and the external counsel that we use data for understanding volumes, understanding trends, understanding costs, understanding options, because we really, I prefer to look at things from a more strategic perspective rather than an individual cost. But data is also super important for setting budgets. And Bob was mentioning that before. You'd ask people before and they're like, I don't know. And I'd say, well, but you're confident you can help me. Yeah. Well, whatever it was that made you confident that you can help make my problem, use that to figure out the budget. Like, how can you're basing it on something. And so for me, the budget is one of the ways of making sure, and it's part of scope expectations and time expectations. Are we all on the same page of what we're trying to accomplish, and how do we measure that we're getting there? How do we, data is one way of measuring, if the firm, if they've set out front, here's the outcome we're working towards, here's how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. That gives us a baseline and some metrics to use for figuring out if we're on track or not, and whether they should be telling us halfway through, you know what, this is costing twice as much, and here's why. Sometimes if it's because they've managed it, I'm like, well, that's not on us. If it's because things have changed, assumptions have changed, let's have a discussion. Let's figure out what our options are for moving forward, and pick a new plan of action. So to me, data is information that allows you to make informed decisions.
I'm just keeping an eye on time. I know each of these, I know we could do a much deeper dive with you into all of these, but I do want to get to our last topic for today, which is the implications of legal ops on the best practices for selecting, retaining, managing legal counsel. I think you've talked about it already, the relationship, right, between the in-house department and external counsel. Other than that piece that you've talked about, which is using the data to define that, give us sort of the bigger picture of how, under the legal ops methodology, the external counsel relationship, sort of from start to finish, maybe a little different than what it looked like 10 years ago?
Well, I think the foundational is we're asking for to set expectations up front. You know, it's going to cost what it costs, and you're going to get a surprise at the end, and hopefully you're happy. You know, it's fundamentally making sure, and it's also integrating the legal advice with the problem that's trying to be solved. So you're not just saying, you know, I've gone and done my analysis, and here's the perfect legal answer. You know, here's what it is. It's like, no, what problem are we trying to solve? There are probably 5 ways of getting there. Let's decide at the beginning which way we're going to go. So in a practical context, in a prior life, I had intellectual property counsel looking at patent portfolios for me, and they gave me very long, very thick, very expensive memos that looked at all 30 patents and told me if they were good patents or bad patents. And I was like, I don't understand why there are only really 2 patents that matter for what we're trying to invest in. So why are we looking at the 28 others? They're just 2 that matter. So let's get on the same page and find out how much it's going to cost to just look at the 2. And you know, there's probably an iterative approach. It's not an all or nothing. It's like they're going to have to look at the 30 to figure out which 2 matter. And then they're going to look at the 2 that matter in detail. So I think part of legal operations is looking at chunking things out and looking at sort of triaging work and staging work and pricing out so you can make the cost benefit decision at each stage. And that means the firm has to have a much better understanding of the client's business and what the client's trying to accomplish. It's not just give me an analysis of the patent estate and do all 30. It's understand what is the client trying to accomplish, so what review makes sense for the client and what they're trying to do. So it's really tailoring the work and doing that cost benefit analysis.
Dana, would you agree with that, what Melissa just said about changing the conversation? But it appears to me that if that's the case, you're actually having a conversation between different people than you would have had under a traditional in-house law firm relationship. Is that right?
I think that's right. And I would go further and say it's centralizing the relationship with the firm as opposed to a specific lawyer. I think, you know, what we've seen in the past is, you know, a corporate team has retained a counsel to do work, and then that lawyer leaves their current state or their current firm and moves to another firm, and so the work follows. And, you know, before you know it, you know, you've got, you know, 6 different firms who are touching your work. And when you're doing that, you're sort of losing an opportunity there. One, certainly in terms of the overall governance of the relationship. 2, the ability to really build close ties with the firm. And so some of the things that, you know, we're interested in finding out more about are, you know, what's the succession plan? We want to build the relationship with a firm as opposed to just a specific individual. So, you know, and then taking it sort of one step further than that, it's in terms of managing the risk. It's, you know, the spend obviously is critical, but as technology grows, you know, so do the risks. And so it's about understanding information management and what steps the firms are taking in order to protect the data that you're providing them with, whether it's personal information or, you know, other confidential information. Their records management and disposition. So, you know, all that to say, setting clear expectations, you know, building out that relationship with the firm and broadening the scope of the discussions from, you know, discrete spend transactions to, you know, that broader, how as an outside counsel firm, are you going to help my corporation deliver on its purpose and its promises to its clients? So that, I think, is certainly a significant change.
I think there's a lot more sort of formality and process. Like you're not just shifting the conversation from individual to individual to entity, but you're also structuring it, and there's a lot more process around it than who you know from when you work together at the firm. Is that right?
That's right.
Shaya, obviously this is the world you live in now, and I think clearly your role is a part of the firm response to that. Give us your perspective on it, either at the micro or the macro level. I mean, there's obviously been a recognition that the firms have to play in this new space where it's an entity to entity rather than personal relationships. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think on the, selecting external counsel, when running an RFP process or just, sending out a fee request, I think it's important to have a clear, efficient, transparent process. And speaking from experience, it's a lot easier to price something out where you have a clear scope of work. You know exactly what you're pricing out. When an RFP comes out or a request comes out without a clear scope of work and they're saying, please provide us with an AFA. Well, sure, we can go and draw up our own scope of work and make our own assumptions. But if 5 other firms are doing the same thing, they're all drawing up a different scope of work, they're all making their own assumptions, and they're all coming up with different price points, it's really hard to evaluate because it's not apples to apples, right? One firm might be 30% more expensive, but their scope of work is 90% narrower. So it's really hard to evaluate. So I think having a clear, transparent process is very important in getting good responses from law firms. And I think so that's on the selection side. On the retention and managing side, I think communication is key. I think law firms, and speaking from my experience, have become pretty good at tracking matters and providing regular updates against the budget. So you know where you are, and ultimately you want to avoid surprises. And beyond that, so there's 2 parts to the communication. There's a matter by matter communication, so you have visibility into the financial health of specific matters. But I think it's also important to set up regular check-ins to provide updates and ensure that the overall relationship is on the right track, that you really understand what the client is currently thinking about, what are their current challenges, and taking that back and incorporating it into the broader relationship. As a general observation, I think we're seeing a reduction and a consolidation of panel firms. And historically, organizations would engage with dozens or sometimes hundreds of law firms. And I think the thinking now is that it's more efficient to work with a smaller group, concentrate the expertise. I mean, as Dana was saying, you can really develop, it really deepens the relationship, and it really solidifies the understanding of the client where you're working, where you have that consolidated volume. And on the law firm side, I think it also gives a bit more room to be creative around pricing, where you have that deeper relationship and you're working across a broader group of practice areas, additional files. If you're working with 50 law firms and you're sprinkling one file across each of those 50 firms, it's a lot more difficult for the law firm to be creative around how they're, pricing and delivering the service. Whereas when you consolidate that, I think it opens up some interesting opportunities.
I think Shaya's touched on a couple of things. I just want to get your thoughts, maybe from sort of the legal market. It sounds to me like people have mentioned what sounds to me like a shift in the power balance in favor of in-house counsels in terms of that relationship, but also what Shaya is saying, if there is a consolidation, is there just a shift even amongst the firms? Could you see a situation where the big firms, like is it the rich get richer in terms of the large clients and their legal work? Could you give us a few thoughts on whether either of those things is true from a legal market perspective?
I think maybe what's partly an answer to that question is that as much as we've been talking here about legal ops within corporate legal departments, we're starting to see law firms create legal ops functions in response to corporate legal ops functions, I think. And part of what's driving that response is the understanding within law firms that they need to focus more on how they deliver their services and designing designing service delivery to be more client focused, more efficient. So I think that's there are not a lot of law firms, I don't think at this point, that have legal ops functions, but there are a lot of law firms that have things like innovation functions or something similar that are really kind of focused on client service and on kind of meeting these demands from clients. So I think that's a key trend of what's going on. I think there's another factor here that we haven't quite hit on that's kind of driving this whole relationship, which is the rise of alternative legal service providers in the legal market. And suddenly, not suddenly, but over the past few years, we've seen the market shifting in a way that there's a broader array of providers who are meeting some of the legal needs of corporate legal departments and meeting them in different ways, being able to deliver maybe more routine kinds of legal services in a more efficient way, using technology, using lower cost staffing options. And so that's also really kind of changed, I think, the relationship between law firms and legal departments, to the point where now law firms are partnering with ALSPs to kind of package together sort of high-end legal advice with more productized kind of legal services and deliver them to corporate legal departments that way. So, it's clearly the drive for greater sort of accountability and efficiency around pricing and costs that's coming out of legal ops is causing significant changes in that relationship and redefining how law firms and legal departments work together. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but that's.
Oh, no, I think I'm glad you raised that point. I'm not glad that I keep getting a prompt that we're technically out of time, but if I could maybe beg each of you in the audience's indulgence for a couple of minutes. I don't want to leave it on that, because I do want to hear from Melissa and Dana and kind of give them the final word on this, maybe picking up from what you just said, Bob. Melissa, do you want to react to what Bob talked about ALSPs and the shift in power?
Yeah, I definitely agree that ASLPs have had an impact, because it's given options to clients. And so it's not either we have capacity inside internally, or we don't, or we need external. There's now a third bucket, and it goes right back to that routine, repetitive, and unique. And there's a lot of routine and repetitive work that can be done at scale in different environments using different providers than the traditional resources and models, particularly if you can use AI or processes to sort of train in the learning that the lawyer has in their head. And so absolutely, their rise has created more options and more leverage for in-house firms or in-house teams.
Dana, last word to you.
No, I agree. And this is something that, goes back to one of those functions that we talked about with legal operations, and it's that strategic planning. What Melissa said about thinking forward, what are going to be the next challenges. And, there will always be pressure on costs. So we need to be flexible, and we need to consider, what the alternatives are that are out there that will allow us to deliver, the services that our business partners need, that our clients need, but in a way that does so in the most efficient way possible.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we will have to leave it there. We are over time. We didn't get to any of the Q&A. Apologies to the audience, but we will sift through some of those questions. Maybe we can get our panel to give you some answers in writing. We could continue for probably another hour. Thank you to everyone on the panel for an entertaining, insightful conversation, or at least the beginnings of one. Thank you to everybody in our audience today. Please look out for our email follow-up following the event with some more details. In the meantime, please also continue the conversation online on our social media channels. That's it for today, but I hope to see everyone in December for the next session in our webinar series, where we will talk about the impact of technology on our courts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.